I want to first introduce myself. My name is Govind Rao. I'm a member of the Nova Scotia CCPA office. I sit on the steering committee. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the CCPA to the Cost of Poverty in the Atlantic Provinces report release with a discussion to follow. We are glad to have the contributors here with us this evening and look forward to the discussion. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge that we are on unceded and unsurrendered ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And as a note, closed captioning is available this evening. You can access closed captioning by clicking the CC button, the two C's button on the Zoom panel. So the Cost of Poverty in the Atlantic Provinces was released yesterday on Wednesday, April 7th. And the report details the cost to Atlantic provinces of not addressing poverty and what gains we would all receive if we were able to raise the standard of living of those living in poverty. Tonight, we'll hear from the co-author and partners on the report. Beginning with a review of the report, we will then hear from each provincial representative, and they'll discuss the report's findings from their particular and respective province. And we should be able to get through those, the intro to the report and those representatives by around 7:30 Halifax time, and then there'll be time for questions and discussions afterwards. And so we ask that you input your questions into the chat function below on this at the bottom of the Zoom window. So first, to introduce our first speaker and co-author of the report, Christine Saulnier. Christine has a PhD in political science from York University. She's the director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Nova Scotia, and she was a co-author of the Nova Scotia and New Brunswick Cost of Poverty reports published by the CCPA in 2010 and 2011, and is a co-author of this new report. So Christine, I'd like to invite you to start with your comments, and then we'll move on after that to Alec, once you're done.
Thanks very much, Govind. I've actually prepared a bit of a PowerPoint since I'm just going over the report and explaining how we came to do the costing. Sorry, Lauren, whatever the next one is. I know you're doing this. Thanks everyone for attending this evening. So great to put some faces to names even over Zoom. Maybe someday we'll see each other again in person. The cost of poverty in the Atlantic provinces, we did release yesterday, and what has been released is the cost broken out for each province in the Atlantic region. The reason that we've released this report, some of you will remember that we released 3 maritime reports back about 10 years ago or so that did a similar costing. This is an updated methodology, uses different data sets. And I would like to acknowledge that Charles Plante, who's on the Zoom with us tonight, is the data guru and the person who updated the methodology. So thank you so much for doing all of that work, Charles, much appreciated. So pleased that we can once again present what we could call a business case about why we need the Atlantic Canadian governments and indeed governments across this country to end poverty. We've certainly, and I know many of the advocates with us tonight have made many moral arguments, arguments that say we need to definitely end poverty because it's a basic human right, and our government is signatories to the United Nations international human rights and should do that. We are providing yet one more piece of evidence to the mound of evidence about why we need to end poverty. This one shows why the cost of poverty is indeed a shared economic cost. It shows us that unlike how sometimes governments present spending on social assistance as something that doesn't have a return on investment, what this report shows us is in fact government's decision not to lift people out of poverty has a steep price tag. And in fact, that price tag is likely higher than if we ended poverty and we actually invested to do that. And this report is really underlying why poverty is indeed a public health issue. It's a societal crisis and an economic problem, and we need to solve it collectively. So how was this done? This is a sort of complex, again, accounting exercise that Charles did. And really to arrive at the costs is what's behind it is a fundamental question. What would the gains be if we were to raise the standard of living of those living in poverty to the second quintile, which essentially means those who are living underneath the poverty line, which in this case is the market basket measure, if we lifted those to basically middle, so the second quintile of 5 is almost the middle, what would happen? How would we see gains from that? And that tells us currently what the costs are. The very first category represents really the largest component of the costs of poverty. This category estimates how much higher the earnings of people living below the poverty line would be if we lifted them out of poverty, and how much of those earnings that they would be able to contribute then to society in taxes, because of course that's what happens. It is calculated based on the indirect costs of poverty that arise when people living in poverty are really prevented from taking full advantage of economic opportunities. And those costs break down to two things, essentially, and they come together into one. But the largest ticket is really around what's called lost productivity. What that means is ideally, everyone who wants to work would have access to a good job, would have the appropriate training and supports to be successful in paid employment. Many things are barriers often to people being able to, including not enough job creation, underemployment for certain groups, sometimes lack of education. This estimate is assuming that the majority of people in low income would be able to work in full-time, full-year, better paying jobs. The other part of that equation is because poverty reduces productivity and economic growth, you have fewer people who are working. This means there is less tax revenue coming into government. And as you know, of course, general tax revenue is what funds goods and services, and that thus has a broader social cost and social benefit. The second category of costs we've named here remedial costs. Those are the direct costs of poverty that arise because of what we know happens when people are living in poverty. People are living in poverty, and that has an impact on their health. It has an impact on their physical health, on their mental health. The stress under which they are living has an impact. Perhaps they don't get access to nutritional food or quality shelter. And what happens is that we know that often not only does living in poverty have an impact on your health, meaning you may require additional health services, but also that people living in poverty have barriers to transportation and other reasons that might prevent them from getting more timely access to care, and thus they may be accessing more expensive emergency care. And so that component of remedial costs is the additional healthcare spending that we have to actually spend on our universal healthcare system because we simply are supporting people to manage to live in poverty instead of lifting them out of poverty. The second cost component of the remedial costs is, again, what the research tells us, and that is living in poverty creates vulnerabilities that result in higher crime commission, but mostly higher victimization rates. That means if you are living in poverty, you are more vulnerable to be a victim of crime, and thus there are excess costs to poverty related to that. I do want to, before I go on, to note that these costs that I will present to you this evening do not include the cost of social assistance. We have not included that in this cost for several reasons. Current social spending is not viewed as a cost of poverty. We never want somebody who is currently living in poverty to think that we are suggesting that they cost us money, but rather that the investment in social services is part of our obligations to each other. We will always need social spending as an investment. We may need that spending to be spent somewhere else, some other way, if we actually support people to be lifted out of and remain out of poverty. But that is not part of these overall costs. The third category of costs is titled intergenerational costs. This is the cost of poverty that is the second largest cost component. And this comes because if children who are currently living in poverty, what the research tells us is those children who are currently living in poverty, about 30% of those children will get caught in poverty. That means that just like the adults that are part of the other costing part of this exercise, those children will be held back. They won't be able to contribute into their full potential. And of course, that has a cost. So all of the other costs are part of this intergenerational cost for 30% of the children who are currently living in poverty. That's just an explanation of those costs. And now I will present to you the numbers. So what are those costs? They're immense. Poverty costs $2 billion per year in Nova Scotia, $1.33 billion in New Brunswick, $273 million in Prince Edward Island, and $959 million in Newfoundland and Labrador. We have 4 provinces that are included in this report, and it really isn't about so much comparing across the provinces as really thinking about each province separately. And thus we do present other numbers for you to understand what that means in your province. Those are not standardized by population. So, the fact that Nova Scotia is the top at 2 billion, we also have the highest population by numbers. It does matter, however, what percentage of your population lives in poverty, because that's part of the calculation. So it's striking then to look at the costs that are represented as an economic cost of GDP. That's the size of the economy. That number is 4.76% of Nova Scotia, but note that PEI actually comes in second on this measure. That's different than the first number. And the third province in terms of GDP growth is 3.71% in New Brunswick and 2.9% in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we do have the costs per person. And one of the reasons we put that in the report, and one that I haven't talked too much about, is so that people understand. One of the numbers that I think we hear sometimes about is, what the debt is per capita. It's not one that I talk about very much. But it's important that we put these numbers into context. And so one of the numbers that we do put in there is the cost per person in your province. In terms of this costing exercise, the other thing that it shows us as we break it out by those components that I explained to you is it shows that governments could better use healthcare resources if we eliminated poverty for the lowest income quintile. That amounts to $204 million in Nova Scotia in excess healthcare costs, $30 million in PEI, $120 million in Newfoundland and Labrador, and just over $126 million in New Brunswick. So you could think about it this way. We could reallocate resources. We could meet unmet other healthcare needs for primary healthcare, for pharmacare, for mental health care. We know that our universal public healthcare system does need more investment. This would be one way we could do a little bit of reallocation. The second category was around crime, and those numbers ranged from 9 million in PEI to 74 million in Nova Scotia. And again, the most significant costs of poverty are those opportunity costs. The highest is 1.4 billion for Nova Scotia. And these numbers actually do include that foregone revenue, though we do break it out in the report. The low is 201 million for PEI, and then we have 200, when we look at provincial revenue, just so you understand, $230 million is lost in foregone revenue because we are holding back this whole swath of people in our population from reaching their potential. That represents 36 million in PEI, and in Newfoundland and Labrador, productivity losses amount to 629 million. And for New Brunswick, it's just under $1 billion at 938 million. And foregone revenue for Newfoundland and Labrador is 95 million, and New Brunswick is 135 million. Those are big numbers. And what, again, I want to conclude after I've shown you all the numbers and how we've arrived at this, is just to say this, the collective decision not to address poverty in our communities affects our ability collectively to reach our full potential, because again, we are holding some in our community back. The costing exercise is one that really considers what the gains could be if we were to raise the standard of living of those living in poverty. And part of what we represented in the report was also the overall poverty rates, the child poverty rates in the 4 provinces, as well as the racialized poverty rates in those provinces. Because the other thing that we want to underline is that there are certain groups in our provinces and our societies that have been made more vulnerable to living in poverty. Indigenous, African Nova Scotians here in Nova Scotia, so people of color. We also know that people with disabilities have higher poverty rates. So if we were to end poverty, we would also be not only starting to address income inequality, we would be starting to address some of the social inequities in our society as well. I will end, I think, my presentation there.
Thank you so much, Christine, for giving us all an overview of the report. And I'd ask Lauren to put the link to the report into the chat if we haven't already, and you have an opportunity then to download and get into the report in much more detail. At this point, I would like to introduce Alec Stratford, who's going to talk, who's the Nova Scotia representative to this report, and will give his comments. Alec is here tonight as the chair of the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing. Alec's day job is as the Nova Scotia College for Social Workers Executive Director and Registrar, and he's had that position since April of 2016. He has a Master's of Social Work degree from the University of Calgary, where he specialized in international and community development. Alec has worked as a child protection social worker in Newfoundland, a school support counselor in Calgary, a community organizer with the City of Edmonton, and as a sessional instructor and course developer at MacEwan University. He has a passion and dedication for community development and believes that engaged, informed, and mobilized communities can lead to transformative change. So Alec, if you have about 3 minutes or so, we're trying to keep everyone to time so that we have time for questions. So I invite you to comment.
Thank you. And thank you to Christine and the authors of this report. It is a striking reminder of the political choices that we make on a daily basis and how just off kilter they are in terms of what we believe are our core values as Canadians, as Atlantic Canadians, and even in terms, and I think what the report really strikingly shows us is just how fiscally reckless our governments are in terms of the choices that they make. I want to start with a brief story because I know I don't have much time, but just to put this into context, I was talking to a social worker the other day who works in the emergency room, and she was telling me the story, again, a story that probably resonates with many folks in this room, of the man who walks into the emergency room when it is, a minus 30 wind chill outside, and comes in and says, I have chest pains. I need to see a doctor. I have chest pains. The doctors at that point in time are required, legally obligated, to run thousands of dollars worth of scans to determine that this person is totally healthy. In walks the social worker to find out that this person is homeless. And they walked in because it was really cold outside and they needed a place to go. And so even there is a striking example of how much money is wasted for not directing, for not addressing this core issue of poverty. Again, housing someone as opposed to paying for thousands of dollars worth of medical scans and professionals just doesn't make any sense. But that is the way we have set up our system to operate at this point in time. We expect people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which is a ridiculous notion. If you've ever actually physically tried to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, it looks ridiculous and it is physically impossible. Again, we put this mentality on folks that that's what they're required to do. And then when they are desperate enough and in need enough, that is when we apply services that are generally more expensive, are generally more stigmatizing, and lead to greater victimization. So, what I take from this report, and I think the call to action that all of us are here today to embrace is that we have to challenge the narrative of scarcity, because again, this report shows us that in fact, there is more than enough to deal with these core issues. Beyond the fiscal argument, which is an important one, there's a clear moral argument, which I know folks have been making as well. As Atlantic Canadians, we genuinely value each other, our communities that we live in, but we haven't built systems that bring those values to life, that genuinely care for one another through empathy, through solidarity. And that is because of political choices rooted in dated ideas of morality, dated fiscal policy, and that can change. And I think that this report really shows us that we have the resources, we have the know-how, and the capacity to make different political choices. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Alec. And now I'd like to go to Mary Boyd for a response and comments from a PEI perspective. Mary Boyd is the coordinator and founder of the McKillop Center for Social Justice in Charlottetown and the PEI Coalition for Poverty Eradication Strategy. She belongs to several organizations, including the Diocesan Council of Development and Peace, and the PEI Trade Justice Coalition and the PEI Health Coalition. So Mary, love to hear some of your short, unfortunately, but during the question period, you'll be able to expand some of your comments on the report from PEI perspective.
Thanks very much, and good evening, everybody. Our annual Child Poverty Report Card for PEI, which was released 4 months ago on December 9th, in that we observed that there was very little to cheer about because poverty has risen in all the age categories. The rate of child poverty is 19.4% according to the latest figures. We use LIM, LIM, and these were the latest available to us at the time. The 4-year trend of slowly reversing child poverty stopped for PEI and in 4 other provinces, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Manitoba and Nunavut. The cost of poverty in the Atlantic region gives us a very comprehensive picture of our poverty. Its message is sobering. Policymakers over the years have been given all the information they need to make serious inroads into poverty, to hasten its elimination, but nothing significant has been done. As Christine points out, we are far more likely to think that poverty should be dealt with by charity. So the operative word is urgent, but also requires ideological change. In all 4 provinces, our governments are underperforming in healthcare. By failing to eliminate poverty, they have created a vicious cycle of causing more illness, which costs the healthcare systems more money that could be put toward the health and well-being of people. Poverty costs PEI healthcare roughly $30 million per year, but in the latest budget on March 12th, roughly $14,150,000 of new money was allocated to health, less than half of the cost of poverty on healthcare. And then we all experience the difficulties in this social safety net, the underperformance of our healthcare system, as Alec's example also illustrates, and we need to press the fact that funds must be reallocated to the unmet public services. Besides the need for a strong social safety net, we also need to create meaningful and important jobs. Good green jobs are waiting to be created and are essential to combating climate change. As the report emphasizes, lost productivity is a big part of the poverty picture. And as it says, ideally everyone who wants to work would have access to good jobs with pay in the second quintile and appropriate training that supports people to be successful in their paid employment. Increases in productivity advances everyone's economic opportunities. Many people want to work, but unemployment is a scourge on this region. It's a scourge on PEI. It takes an unbelievable toll on people, families, society, and overall physical and mental health. Intergenerational poverty costs are the second largest cost component of being trapped in the cycle of poverty. It is a tragedy when people can't realize a full life and their full right to human dignity. They are missing so much, and society is missing so much because of this situation. We often hear people putting themselves down, expressing a lack of self-worth, apologizing for their very existence. It's morally wrong to do this to people. Where is the vision of our political leaders in all of this? And I agree that we have to challenge the narrative of scarcity and the debt and deficit myth that goes around. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary. Now we'll turn to Kerri Claire Neil, who is a community organizer from Baccalieu Trail in Newfoundland, and with a background in social economics. And she is co-chair of the Social Justice Cooperative Newfoundland Labrador, and is most actively involved in the Anti-Capitalist Book Club, Food Sovereignty Action Team, and member engagement. She can be usually found cleaning shelves at Downtown Comics or hanging out with her cat, Jackie. Kerri Claire.
Hello, thank you. It's so great to see so many people here tonight and so many friendly faces, or at least friendly names. I am calling in today from the beautiful, foggy Mi'kma'ki in the community known by our colonial government as St. John's. And of course, our government continues to lay claim to the unceded territories of the Innu, Inuktitut, the Inuit in Nunatavut, and is under-resourcing the communities in Nunatavut, where people are experiencing extreme overcrowded housing, ridiculously high food prices, heat insecurity, as many are relying on diesel and biofuel, and of course, the very real climate change as the land beneath them is melting away as they try to travel their lands and practice their traditional way of life. And I think their experience is an extreme example, but one that rings true to many people in our province who are facing housing insecurity, food insecurity, heat insecurity, especially with the looming threat of Muskrat Falls, which is a mega hydro dam that was built on the Grand River and starting to double our power rates here on the island. And our federal government is now threatening us with the Atlantic Loop and discussion of another mega dam on the Grand River called Gull Island, which I hope you'll all join me in resisting the further destruction of that river. We see the impact of poverty here in our province on people's physical health, as our healthcare system is not universal, and many people are not getting the treatment they need, and so often, it gets much worse, and they end up kind of needing more extreme procedures, which of course cost more. And we also see the impact in people's mental health, in the stress and the anxiety and the depression when you're not sure where your next meal is coming from, or if you're going to be able to pay your bills and take care of your family. Which again, of course, as demonstrated in this report, has significant healthcare costs. We also know that our criminal justice system exasperates poverty with the criminalization of drugs, of sex work, and even petty theft, which really entrenches people in a cycle of poverty. And again, has significant health costs and cost to our government. And you know, we do have a 19th century dungeon that is currently being used as a prison here on the island. And it definitely needs to be changed, but our government is responding by increasing spending on prison and building a bigger prison. And we know when governments build bigger prisons, it just means more people get incarcerated. And so that cycle expands. So yeah, I guess those are a few issues that we're seeing here in our province. I hope that this report does speak to our policymakers. We are here in Newfoundland Labrador expecting an austerity budget as our Premier has put together a team of his friends to gut our public services. So we hope that this report has some impact, and we hope that you all continue to do the advocacy work that you do to push for a better social safety net and more caring communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerri Claire. And now I wanted to introduce Chelsea Driscoll. She's a social researcher at the Human Development Council in St. John, New Brunswick. She holds an MA in economics and leads living wage calculations in New Brunswick, as well as New Brunswick's Child Poverty Report Card in partnership with Campaign 2000. Chelsea.
Thank you, and again, nice to see everyone tonight and to see so many people out to support this fantastic report that Christine and Charles have put together. I'll speak very briefly, as I know we have another New Brunswick representative to speak after me. The part that I'll focus on, as was mentioned, I focus on, or not focus, one of my research initiatives is the Child Poverty Report Card. So I'm going to focus on the intergenerational costs piece. As Christine mentioned, when she presented the fantastic findings from this report, intergenerational costs, New Brunswick are about $224 million. And when we see, like, the part that stands out to me with this report is when you see that number for intergenerational costs specifically, that just sends alarm bells off in my head, that is money that could be reallocated to some child poverty reduction initiatives. So we know from our 2018 tax filer data, the most recent data that we have available, that 1 in 5 children, sorry, that would be much worse. 1 in 5 children in New Brunswick lives in poverty, which is roughly 330,000 children. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my numbers tonight. We have the 6th highest poverty rate out of the provinces and territories in Canada, and the 2nd highest out of the Atlantic provinces. And with these numbers, it is very clear that, you know, having intergenerational costs and having children trapped in the cycle of poverty, even if, you know, 30% is a cost that we just can't bear to have. I won't go into all the details because I'm trying to be brief, but in our report card, we do highlight a number of recommendations to the provincial government of ways that we could eradicate child poverty. We know that there's no silver bullet policy, and not one policy change is going to eliminate or reduce these numbers in our province. But knowing that there's $224 million on the table that could be reallocated to some of these initiatives is huge. So a few of the recommendations we lay out in our child poverty report card, as well as in our living wage research that I've done, one key recommendation would be childcare. We know that that's an enormous burden on families in New Brunswick, that we need a public system that's universal, accessible, affordable, with more spaces. The current subsidies that we have are leaving too many families behind. And other recommendations that we make in our report is setting a timetable to raise our minimum wage, revisiting social assistance reform, making sure that we are seeing increases more frequently and that they are aligning with the market basket measure. And of course, initiatives for basic needs, housing, food security. All of these are things that we could reallocate some of that money towards to help lower those child poverty numbers. So I could go on and on about this, but I will end there and let Abram continue talking about some of the statistics for New Brunswick.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. I'll introduce Abram in a second. I just wanted to mention that after Abram speaks, we'll be taking questions from the audience via the chat function. So if you do have a question, you can we'll start collecting them. Please type it into the main chat. And if you have a question for a specific speaker, please indicate who the question is for. And now to introduce Abram Lutes is the provincial coordinator for the Common Front for Social Justice New Brunswick and a labor organizer and graduate researcher in political economy. Abram. You may be muted. Yeah, you're muted. Let me see if I can't unmute you, but hopefully you'll be able to figure it out, Abram. There you go.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you for the introduction, Govind. I'm cognizant of the time, so I'll just raise a few things. So the Common Front for Social Justice is an organization of workers and of people who live in poverty, and we act as a spokesperson on issues relevant to the causes of labor and to the causes of people in poverty. And so this report is really important, really useful for us. I want to highlight that every year we participate in budget consultations with the province. We submit recommendations and highlight the urgency to address low wages and social assistance rates and so forth. In the most recent budget consultations, in spite of the rising costs of food, the rising costs of housing, the fact that wages have been more or less static for almost 50 years, the government had no place to discuss poverty in its budget. And when the budget was showcased, they talked about private investment and how this budget is good for the private sector and private sector growth, and that this will somehow result in a better New Brunswick. But we know that this is not the case, and I want to draw a contrast between the rhetoric of some of our political class and the urgency in this document. And I think that that's a really important point, especially as we talk about a recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. What kind of policies are going to be prioritized, and what do we think of as a recovery from the kind of devastation in the health sector to people's lives and to the economy? And so I think as the Common Front, we're going to move forward with this really useful, really beneficial data and continue to highlight how it shows the return for all of us on increasing wages, investing in social assistance, and investing in public services, and building a society based on the principles of solidarity and justice.
Thank you, Abram. So now we've come to the 20 minutes that we have for questions for the speakers. I see that there's already one question. I want to introduce Charles Plante, who is a co-author of the report and is joining us for the question and answer period. And he, along with being co-author, he was the lead data analyst and the person who updated the methodology. Charles is the Houston Family Research Fellow in Health and Social Inequality at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan. And he was co-author of Saskatchewan's Cost of Poverty report in 2014 and has led recent efforts to update these numbers for all provinces. He has a PhD in sociology from McGill University. So welcome also, Charles. So we'll go to the first question, and maybe it's to all speakers, but I'd say that maybe we'll just take maybe two speakers' responses on this, whoever wants to kind of put their hand up and jump in. So do you believe it is possible for everyone to have good jobs under racialized capitalism? And could you expand briefly on your answer? So who would like to start with that one? Well, I see Carrie, so why don't you start and we'll go to one other person after you.
Thanks for that question. It's a really tough one. I've been reading Border and Rule by Harsha Walia lately, and she talks about kind of the debilitation, I guess, that's caused by extreme poverty, and the way that like our our capitalist, colonialist, imperialist like government and state, cause from both the land dispossession and the labor exploitation, the way it kind of grinds us down and how hard that is. And I think a lot of us feel forced into the jobs that we have because we're so scared of poverty, and we're so scared about like what happens and when we're not able to take care of ourselves because we know the government isn't going to take care of us. But I think people are able to still find joy in certain jobs. And I think there is still ways to find joys in the things that we're doing. And maybe that's not always our paid labor. So I guess it depends kind of how you define your job. But I think, it's a tough one about how do you find the joy in what has been structured as a really violent, I think, and oppressive system.
Well, then it's Mary Boyd. I'd like to say that I believe that we can do a great deal more in job creation, and other people have done that. There is something called the job guarantee, which some excellent economists have been talking about, and which has caught the ear of Joe Biden for the United States, and it's based on the Roosevelt New Deal. It wouldn't take that long to implement that, but it's decent jobs with decent pay, and there's a job bank because the community decides which jobs it needs, and it's federally funded and locally administered. And when you go into that job bank, you come up with a job and appropriate training to work into that. It could have, by creating those jobs and working in that way, it would have an enormous change on the structures and the whole system. But it would create this kind of better situation that we have, and most people want to work, but they need to work for decent pay and they need to have decent conditions. So yes, I believe that even if we moved in those directions, that we would start to overcome some of the prejudice that exists and the discrimination that keeps so many people back. And the Indigenous people, I've talked with them about it, and they seem very interested because periodically they take stock of the jobs and the things that are needed in their reservation or whatever they're in, and they want jobs and they want to work and they want meaning in their lives through paid jobs. And so they're very, very interested in these things. And so I see that as, yes, it is a real possibility of doing something and creating change at the same time.
Okay, well, thank you to Kerri and Mary and the questioner. I have a question from Jim, and maybe I'll start with Christine or Charles as the co-authors. Are there stats that specifically address intergenerational poverty? How does poverty relief reverse a downward spiral?
Christine, yeah, you could speak to that, but yeah, so in the methodology, we do bring intergenerational poverty into things, and our numbers are based on Miles Korak's numbers. More recently in Canada, SESCAN has made some more powerful data sets that should allow us to do even more of this type of work in the future in Canada. But in terms of how does poverty relief reverse a downward spiral, it's about providing a floor for people, right? It's about giving them a table or a step that they can step off of when people are in poverty. You know, it feels like everything's falling out from underneath you, and no matter what you do, you can't get up. And so poverty relief, if it's done effectively, whether it's income supports or different types of services and programs, it's about providing people with that basic ability or capability to function in the world and take advantage of opportunities that people that don't live in poverty take for granted to be able to take advantage of.
Mm-hmm. Christine, would you like to chime in too?
I mean, I think Charles has covered it. In fact, if you scroll in the chat, there's lots of information that's been shared about this in particular and the impact that living in poverty has on children, on in fact their brain development and and why it's so important. And I think it was Chelsea that also talked about that crucial investment in early learning and childcare. You know, we need to recognize that we need a universal system. It shouldn't matter whether your family's working or in training or none of that, right? I mean, why did we decide that when you turn a certain age, you get access to a universal education system, but if you're under that age, you don't? I think that's critical. I think we know the impact of sending children to school hungry. That alone is significant. So, you know, if a child is living in a household, and I know Alec could speak to this as well, the stress that's on families as they try to provide for their children, that stress impacts the children as well. You know, we look to the South and they often talk about the American dream. You know, the saying goes, the American dream was never possible anywhere but Sweden, right? And in Canada, there was a time when it was more possible, when our children, generations children, could do better than their parents. And we're seeing less of that. You know, I was struck the other day, I was looking again at tuition. If you haven't looked at tuition lately, have a look at how high tuition is. Nova Scotia has the highest in the country. I think average is something around $7,000 a year. A medical degree in Nova Scotia is $21,000 a year. Like, you know, we've made it so that so many people, not only are they living in poverty, but we're making it so that they have very, very few options. And without options, you have no choices.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Christine. I'll open this up to any of the panelists or commentators. A question from John: is there any data on the effect of education spending on different wealth groups over the long run? So I would imagine that means in terms of investments in primary and secondary and tertiary, post-secondary education, and how that, I would imagine, evens things out, or allows people to move up in income ladder. Is there anyone who would like to speak to that?
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly and talk about, certainly in Nova Scotia, the prevalence of charity-run food programs in schools. Let's just think about that for a minute in terms of how we've responded to educational needs of children and youth. Is that teachers who are there to teach had started to recognize that you can't teach a child who is coming to school hungry. And so, you know, we involved a charity model to try and fill that gap. And so certainly in Nova Scotia, there's every school seems to have some kind of different program that provides that food. Again, from community volunteers, from different folks giving money, and it's just a piecemeal system. But again, I think it speaks to the point of the question, which is that, yeah, it has a huge impact on how kids and youth are able to learn, how teachers are able to teach. And it's, I mean, we know the impact, again, that it has developmentally in terms of behaviors, in terms of your capacity to grow and learn. So again, I'll let the researchers talk about if there's any specific data, but certainly it has a huge impact in terms of how people learn and how we teach on top of that.
Thank you, Alec. I think I'm gonna move on to the next question, and I'll open this up to the different any of the provincial representatives on the panel. A question from Hafsa: what are some impactful policies that you know of that municipal governments can use or create or facilitate to facilitate more equitable local economies? Are any of you aware of some positive things that local governments and municipal governments have done in your province? So who would like to try that? Or Christine, I see you also wanting to jump in.
I mean, I was going to jump in and say one of the amazing things that happened over the last little while in Halifax is that our Halifax Regional Municipality, which is an employer, you know, I want to underline that our municipalities are also employers. They decided to ensure that, and contractors, that every contract that they make includes a living wage requirement. our municipal governments should be leading the charge on paying living wages, ensuring their contractors are paying a living wage. That to me seems like a very obvious one. I think the other one that we've seen municipalities shy away from is ensuring that procurement contracts, include living wages, but also include requirements around those who are being underemployed, that we ensure that we are actually providing jobs for underemployed and unemployed, those who are facing discrimination in our community, who haven't had the same opportunities. And we've certainly seen municipalities kind of run scared from that. We could see more of that happening. Also just kind of what's called the import replacement. So doing much more here in the province and in our municipalities to support things like cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives. Those kinds of things are things that our municipalities could be doing, let alone, affordable housing and all of the rest of it. But others could certainly speak from their province perspective.
Yeah, I see it. Abram, if you want to go ahead, and then Alec.
I don't necessarily have a positive example. I do have an example of what not to do, which is to shirk responsibilities for acting on these things through jurisdictional language. So a lot of times I think it is true that municipalities in Canada do not have a lot of power relative to provinces and federal governments, but there is still a lot they can do. And a lot of times this lack of constitutional status is used as a crux by municipal governments to say, well, there's nothing we can do at all. For example, in Fredericton recently, the city council said there's nothing we can do to address housing issues or to address poverty because those are provincial jurisdictions. And while that's maybe the letter of some law written somewhere, Canada is a signatory to numerous human rights declarations, including ones that affirm the right to housing. And that is an obligation of all governments at every level to attempt to fulfill where they're able. So pushing your municipal governments to challenge this sort of jurisdictional dodging, I think is really important, while at the same time asking that provinces and the federal government do their part too. I think the contracting example that Christine gave is a really good example of something municipal governments can do. There's also a lot of talk of what's called bringing services in-house. We've gone through a wave of privatizations in municipal management, and we know that it just doesn't work. And so pushing governments and municipal governments are already doing this because privatized services are so inefficient at delivering the services they're supposed to. But pushing your governments to do more things in-house, to bring those things back into public ownership, can stimulate the local economy and make sure that people are taken care of.
I know there's lots of questions, so I won't take up too much time on this, but I think it's a really interesting one based on both of what Christine and Abram have said about what municipalities can do, what they said they haven't do. But I think it's important that when we think about political decisions, there's that old saying that all politics is local, and it doesn't get any more local than municipal politics. And again, there is a level of engagement with municipal politicians that is slightly different. They're not partisan generally. Hopefully they are ideological, but they're not partisan. So there's a capacity to influence in a different way. And I think there are striking examples of what cities can do really well. A lot of poverty, a lot of equity is influenced even with how we build our cities, how we move folks around, how we zone appropriately. For example, in Halifax right now, there's lots of development happening, and it's ridiculous the amount and how it's going in. But strikingly, what we've lost in that development is a continuum of housing options for folks. For instance, there's very few single bedroom dwellings anymore for folks, and that was a zoning decision and bylaws decision by municipal politicians to allow those developments to come in or to allow those changes to happen. So there's a lot that can happen at a municipal level. I'll just make one more point that certainly in Nova Scotia in the 90s, municipalities were much more involved in delivering social services. They were much more localized, and there was a much more of a community essence in that. We, again, through the neoliberal agenda, wanted to cut costs and centralize services. So we took a lot of those powers away from municipalities to do that. I think that that's a decision that really needs to be reevaluated in the current context.
Chelsea, I saw you turned on your screen. Did you want to jump in or on another question? Because we have a couple of ones, and I mean, we're going to have to end in a minute, unfortunately. I see your hand, Carrie, as well, but go ahead.
No, I'm good. I didn't realize my screen was off. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. I'm going to ask, I'll pitch one more question that we received by email, and then we'll have to wrap up because we do respect people's time and we want to keep to the hour that we have scheduled. We got a question by email from Stephanie about, there's a real push for immigration to Canada, but of course, new immigrants face barriers to entry. And is the strategy is the government strategy just to condemn a certain portion of new immigrants to low-paying jobs and poverty? Or I guess, I mean, what is the solution to that? Like, what are solutions to raising people out of poverty that both help new immigrants and older settlers and people who are not settlers to Canada? So if there's someone who'd like to, I see Carrie, your hand. So why don't you try that, and then we'll go to one other person.
I've done a lot of research on Canada's temporary foreign worker program, and I think it's pretty disgusting what's happening. Those workers are being forced into kind of the 3D jobs, degrading, dirty, and dangerous. And they are the jobs that Canadians are rejecting because the wages are low. There's very few like occupational health and safety regulations, especially when you look at the agricultural sector. But here in our province, we're seeing a lot of temporary foreign workers in your Tim Hortons, in your McDonald's, because our minimum wage here is just too low. And yeah, there's real push to make a $15 minimum wage campaign policy in this recent election. And of course, only one party kind of agreed to that. And there's been a lot of resistance to that. So I think that would be like really one great way to make sure that the people who are coming in are able to afford life here and aren't forced to like live in housing provided by their employer and like work these like very horrible jobs because Canadians won't do it.
We have about 30 seconds for someone else. Christine, why don't you have the last word on this, and then I'll wrap for the evening.
Well, I mean, I think the way that we've approached immigration, I'd say over the last, 22 decades, is really this econocentric form of immigration that is really focused on bringing economic migrants here. We've not done enough on the refugee side of things and the humanitarian side of things, and we need to do more of that work. And obviously, we need to do more on permanent status. I mean, it's just disgusting to know that, we're rolling out a vaccine program during a pandemic, and there are people in our community who will not get access to vaccines because of the barriers they face as quote unquote illegal immigrants in our country. So, I mean, I think it's an entire shift of the way that we think about, I think Alec started us off thinking beyond scarcity. That applies to us as a country, as the 10th richest country in the world. We need to be doing more, and our communities need to be more welcoming to a range of immigrants who can come here and get permanent status. And we haven't seen a government that's been willing to shift that way. And I think that's what we need to see. And as I think Carrie has said, I mean, we like to talk about a lack of labor, but we don't like to talk about how low wages are and job conditions and why employers need to address those, while we also make sure that we meet our international obligations. We can do all of that. Let's be clear. No province, no matter what the rhetoric is poor. We live in a federation that is very rich, and we are making choices. And one of them is that many, many people in our community are confined to living in poverty, and that is policy created.
Thank you, Christine. I want to thank now all the speakers for this evening who have contributed, the co-authors to this wonderful report, the strong report, and the commentators. To thank Christine, Alec, Mary, Kerri Claire, Chelsea, and Abram. and to co-author Charles for joining us for the question and answer period. We'd like to acknowledge that the updated methodology and costing of poverty project that was done by Charles was funded in part by Upstream, a sub-project of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And while this costing is not comparable to the previous reports published by the CCPA-NS, these reports have informed the writing of this one, and therefore we want to acknowledge lead author Angela McEwen for her contributions to that work. Thanks also to Iglika Ivanova, senior economist at the CCPA-BC, who was instrumental in supporting this recalculation. And this report is being released in partnership with the New Brunswick Common Front for Social Justice, the Human Development Council, the Social Justice Cooperative of Newfoundland and Labrador, the McKillop Centre for Social Justice, the PEI Coalition for a Poverty Eradication Strategy, and the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing. Thank you to the Common Front, Human Development Council, and CUPE Atlantic Region for providing some funding or support for the publication of this report. Lastly, we encourage you to join the CCPA newsletter and to stay up to date with reports and events, and Lauren will put the link there in the chat. As well, if you would like to support the CCPA-NS, please consider going to the CCPA website and donating to the Nova Scotia Research Fund or your provincial, actually, we're unfortunately the only office so far in the Atlantic region, but so your donation will have to come to the NS until we can build offices in the other provinces. So thank you for joining us and have a really great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you across the region. Let's do more.
Good to see everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Really enjoyed the chat. Nice to see so many people here.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, everybody. Great to hear from you all. Great to be part of this. Somebody mentioned in the chat we should continue to talk. I totally agree. I hope you all have a good rest of your night.
Great.
Thanks, Govind.
Thank you. Bye-bye.